begin transmission? Well, if you ignore all the ants and you forget completely about insects, the most dominant life form on this planet are the vertebrates. They're definitely the largest and the most obvious, and they bear a striking resemblance to us. So they're the most similar to us physiologically and anatomically, and so they're very important members of the ecosystem, kind of top-down influencers. The insects provide a lot of the foundational nutrients for ecosystems, but it's the vertebrates that are those apex predators, the top of the food chain type of creatures. And like I said, they're very similar to us, so they're often people's favorite organisms because they're adorable, like this fantastic looking, adorable, cute gecko, or these baby finnick foxes. So vertebrates are adorable. We'll talk about mammals and birds and reptiles in sequence. This lecture will just give a very brief overview of amniotes as a group, and I'll try my best to not talk too much about dinosaurs. I wish we could have a whole lecture on dinosaurs, but I'm trying to restrict myself to just a few highlights and just focusing on what amniotes are and how they're adapted to life on land. What makes amniotes distinctive is their eggshells, and all three lineages, the reptiles, the birds, and the mammals, have a distinct way of incubating their young. Reptiles have a thick, leathery eggshell, birds have a hard, calcified eggshell, and then mammals incubate their young in uterus. So there's extensive parental care in mammals, and this allows all of these amniotes to colonize a diversity of truly terrestrial habitats. So no longer are they tied to water at any time in their life cycle, as are amphibians, who have to return to the water to lay their jelly-filled eggs. If you take those jelly-filled eggs of the salamander or frog and you wrap them in an eggshell that prevents desiccation, now you're able to lay them in mountains or forests or even deserts if the egg is semi-permeable enough. So the challenge is you want the egg to be solid enough that water doesn't escape too rapidly, but if it's completely locked in, then you can't respire, so no oxygen can get through. So the leathery eggs of reptiles and then the calcified eggs of birds are all semi-permeable, so oxygen can get through, but water most of the time can't, which is a really great adaptation. Amniotes are a really diverse group with origins deep in the Carboniferous period. So according to conventional thinking, this is a very, very long time ago. And the amniotes are going to have evolved from some kind of amphibian-like ancestor, something like maybe this guy, a Diplocaulus. This is kind of an amphibian-type animal that is extinct. And I want to point out what this chart is really showing, this kind of an overview of amniote evolution. And so an evolutionary thinker is going to interpret these fossil evidence as lineages upon lineages through time. And as we talked about earlier in the semester, a creationist is going to look at this as seeing fossils buried in a sequential ecological order all at once during the flood. And so there are two different ways you can interpret this, but it's important that you understand the conventional model very thoroughly. So the conventional model is that amniotes arose from some kind of amphibian-like ancestor down here. And I want to point out some of these cool lineages because there's a whole lot of diversity in amniotes that we're not really going to get to. We're going to focus on mainly the ones up in here. But I want to point out that you have this lineage right here, the Lepidopterosaurs. We've talked a little bit about we haven't talked about them. We're going to talk about the reptiles, and those are arising from the Lepidopterosaur ancestry. And also arising from that ancestry, you have the ichthyosaurs and the plesiosaurs and then the mosasaurs, and which are pretty phenomenal predatory marine organisms. The mosasaur is this gigantic 40-foot predator that could take on sharks, and really fascinating creatures. And then you have the Lepidopterosaur lineage leading to snakes, lizards, and tuatars, and turtles. And then, actually, I wanted to point out that turtles are not part of the Lepidosaurid lineage. So the Lepidosauros, snakes, lizards, and tuataras, and turtles are just off on their own with a really, really deep ancestry way far back in time, and they just kind of hang out for their whole evolutionary history, just being turtles, which is pretty interesting. This creature right here is a Trypanosaur, and this is a representative of the Archosaurian lineage. Trypanosaurs are a remarkable example of convergent evolution with chameleons. So chameleons evolve eventually way over here. Trypanosaurs are way down here. But if you look at their features, they have these strange kind of articulated hands that they use to grip branches, and they have a prehensile tail with a keratinized claw at the end, which is very unusual. And then they have a really highly kinetic skull that they use to presumably eat insects. So a pretty interesting, unusual creature there, the Trypanosaur, which is convergently evolved with chameleons. And then if you look more along this Archosaurian lineage, you see your classic dinosaurs here and the pterosaurs. Eventually, I want to point out that the living members of the Archosaurian lineage are the crocodiles and the birds. And so we kind of think intuitively of crocodiles being kind of grouped with this group over here, but these are Lepidosaurs and these are Archosaurs. Birds, also being Archosaurs, nest most closely with crocodiles. So in the most closely related genetic relative of birds are crocodiles. But I want to point out some cool pterosaurs. These are flying reptiles. They're not dinosaurs, as conventionally thought. There are 3 different lineages here, right? So these pterosaurs are flying reptiles. Most of them are predators, like this gigantic Quetzalcoatlus, who had a 40-foot wingspan and could walk on his 4 legs. It would be about the height of a giraffe, so about 20 feet tall, and he could just bend down and pick up little dinosaurs as they munched along. This would be a terrifying sight to see if you're a human. You're a 6-foot human, and think about a giraffe with a 10 to 12 foot long beak, and it likes to eat 5-foot tall humans for lunch. On the other extreme, you have some really tiny pterosaurs like this one, which is called a neurognathus, which means the tailless jawed one. And you can see this is a strange little pterosaur. It's kind of cute. It probably had little tiny downy like feathers on it, and it didn't have a big beak. Instead, it had a small mouth with teeth, large eyes. It was probably nocturnal. And this one only had about a 6-inch wingspan, so it was primarily an insectivore, and probably filled a similar role to bats. So there are a whole lot of diversity of animals that we don't really get to talk about. I wish we could talk more about these extinct amniotes, but our focus is on these extant amniotes, these ones here. And of course, the dinosaurs, can't help but mention the dinosaurs here, and it is from a theropod lineage, of which the T-Rexes also arose, that the birds are said to have originated. And in our timeline here, so if we look back at Earth's history, we see all these fossil organisms, and then during the Second Great Dying, all of these animals went extinct as well. The first Great Dying, I think I pointed out last time, happens way back here with a lot of marine animals. But this is a really important boundary marker right here. You see most of the dinosaurs die. And if you're a young Earth creationist, this is conventionally considered to be the end of the flood. And so what we see after that is the diversification of arc kinds. And what I find also interesting about this chart is the relative diversification rates. So if you look at turtles, they're pretty constant for way, way far back in time, right? 300 million years, they've had their little shells, and they've just been little turtles. And in the meantime, 300 million years ago, you have all of the archosaurs and mammals evolve in that same time period. So it's just phenomenal to me which lineages apparently diversify more rapidly than others, and why. That's kind of an interesting ongoing question. So let's take a look at the extant amniotes. We're going to have mammals, reptiles, and birds. And as you notice, the birds and the crocodiles are closely related. The Dinosauria would be kind of in between these guys here and these guys here. But as it stands now, we have the Archosaurs, and then we have the Lepidosaurs, the extant Lepidosaurs, and then we have those turtles. And you'll notice that the position of the turtle is a polytomy, so there's 3 branches right at that place. What this means is that for order Testudines, the turtles, we don't really know where they belong. Are they kind of Archosaurian? Are they Lepidosaurian? Are they something else entirely? We don't really know for sure. They don't really belong anywhere except in our hearts, because we all love turtles. The best way to distinguish these lineages is by the shape of their skull. And so the anapsid skull is the ancestral shape, and what this is going to be referring to are extra orbits in their skull. So this orbit is the eye socket essentially, and then you can have either 1 extra lateral temporal opening or 2. And if you have 1, it's a synapsid skull, and if you have 2, it's a diapsid skull. So the ancestral state is an anapsid skull without any kind of fancy openings. What is the purpose of these openings? Well, they serve as muscle attachments. So they allow for really highly complex jaws and for biting, chewing, gripping, tearing, nipping, rather than just grabbing and swallowing. So the more complex jaws you have, the more openings you'll have for muscle attachments. So the synapsid skulls eventually arose, gave rise to the mammals. So all mammals have synapsid skulls. And there are some really interesting ones like this one, Archaeotherium, which is no longer extant, but this is called the pig from hell, because this is a predatory, or at least omnivorous, 7-foot tall, 1,000-pound pig with really sharp razor canine teeth, and it looks pretty intimidating. So this is a synapsid animal, and all mammals are synapsid. If we look at the diapsid clade here, right here, this is a monophyletic group that's going to include the Archosaurs, Lepidosaurs, and we'll throw in turtles there for good luck. And so all of these guys have diapsid skulls. So this is a Burmese jeweled monitor lizard, which just looks like a fantastic dragon type creature. Unfortunately, they're endangered and will probably go extinct because of the trading in their skin. Really beautiful, beautiful animals, and they have a diapsid skull. A lot of the diapsid skulls have fused back together. So in the Archosaurians, the birds, their skulls usually appear at first to be anapsid, but ancestrally they have 2 holes. Their skulls have just fused to, because they don't have complex jaws, right? When was the last time you saw a bird eat a hamburger? Chew a hamburger at least. So birds don't really need the complex jaws, but they need a lightweight skull, so they've done away with the extra muscles. Anapsid skulls, turtles are a strange one, because if you look at this turtle shell, you see an orbit for the eye, but you don't see any other orbit. So turtles are anapsid, which is a little confusing according to this timeline, because anapsid skulls are the ancestral kind, and then diapsid skulls arose, and then turtles became anapsid again. So according to this tree, at least this interpretation of the evolutionary history, the turtle lineage had a loss of its diapsid opening. So it originated anapsid, then became diapsid, and then went back to being anapsid again. So a little bit of confusing history there. Turtles kind of mess up some interpretations of phylogeny. Now the amniotic egg is, of course, the characteristic trait of amniotic animals. And the amniotic egg is going to have 4 primary layers to it. And if you think about these, if you think about the functions of an organism, you can correlate these pretty easily. The embryo, of course, is the growing, maturing offspring. And then the mineralized shell, that's going to vary depending on your lineage. Like I said, the reptiles kind of have a leathery shell. Birds have a hardened, calcified shell, and then mammals don't have a shell at all. The the allantois is primarily for waste excretion. So this takes care of all the waste, which is something you're going to have to do if you're a living thing. The amnion cushions and protects the embryo, and then the yolk sac provides the nutrients. I forgot one. Oh, the chorion. The chorion is responsible for respiration. So chorion is respiration, allantois is osmoregulation, waste excretion, amnion is a fluid-filled cushiony sac for protection, and then the yolk sac is for nutrients. Now, if we think back to amphibians had kind of thin, highly vascularized membranes around their skin for cutaneous respiration, and amniotes don't have that. So one of the traits of true terrestriality, meaning they don't require living in streams or near puddles or even in ephemeral ponds. These guys can really branch off on their own and colonize a forest or even a desert. You have to have thicker and more waterproof skin. So you can't, water loss is still a problem, and you don't want to lose water from your skin. So the adaptation is highly keratinized scales over the entire body. In mammals, this is going to be in the epidermis, and you're going to have hair, but in birds have feathers, and then reptiles are going to have epidermal scales. So thick scales to keep water in, but this means that you can't respirate through your skin. So how are you going to respirate while minimizing water loss? You're going to have internal lungs that are highly vascularized, lots of surface area. So lungs are the most complex in terrestrial amniotes, and they're incredibly efficient for extracting and exchanging oxygen and carbon dioxide from the air. But it's all internal. There's no gills, there's no cutaneous respiration. It's all internal. Some turtles breathe through their cloacas as kind of a supplementary respiration, but most of the time this is going to be through the mouth into thoracic lungs. And then following from that, you're going to have rib ventilation and aspiration that's drawing air into your body. So in amphibians and fish that breathe air, like the lungfish, they kind of gulp air and swallow it and kind of push it down into their lungs. But in amniotes, their ribs and diaphragm, their muscles expand, and it creates a negative pressure that draws air in passively. So it's much more efficient. But the rib ventilation is going to cause all the limbs and everything to adapt to. So just going from having thicker and more waterproof skin, you can kind of see a cascade of adaptations that kind of all interlock together to make a true terrestrial animal. And because you can exploit a whole lot of different environments, those environments are filled with a variety of food sources, some vegetarian and some juicy, crunchy insects, and other amniotes as well. So you're going to also see a corresponding increase in complex jaw musculature. So for the synapsids and the diapsids, they're going to have complex muscles that attach to their skulls, and they can move their jaws back and forth for chewing or gripping, swallowing, etc. And they're also going to have more of a bite force. So think about a crocodile versus a frog, about the bite force. So much stronger jaws. Amniotes are going to breathe with something called a double circulatory system. And this isn't, the double circulatory system isn't restricted just to amniotes. Amphibians kind of have something similar. So the double circulatory system is basically you're going to have a pulmonary circuit where the blood flows into your lungs, and then you're going to have then the other part of the double circulatory system is the systemic circuit. So pulmonary circuit to your lungs, systemic circuit to the rest of your body. In the lungs, you're going to exchange deoxygenated blood, and the deoxygenated blood will pick up oxygen to become oxygenated, and then will flow into your heart, which will then pump it to the rest of your body. And if we look at the difference here between amphibians with lungs, turtles, and birds and mammals, is this line right here in the heart. These little chambers here are the ventricles, And in birds and mammals, there's a complete separation of ventricles. So one thing eventually you'll need to do is trace the flow of blood through the body. And so I'll just give you that real fast, and then we'll talk about it again when we talk about birds. But oxygenated blood in the red is going to flow into the left atrium of the heart, and then into the left ventricle, which then pumps it through the systemic circuit, where your cells use it all up, and then the deoxygenated blood returns to the right atria of the heart, and then flows into the right ventricle, then it gets pumped into the lungs, where it picks up oxygen, and then it goes again. So pulmonary circuit, systemic circuit, complete separation of ventricles means that there's no mixing of deoxygenated and oxygenated blood. In birds and mammals, this leads to really high cardiovascular pressure, so high blood pressure, and it's really important if you're a fast-moving animal, which birds and mammals are. They require and use a lot of energy. Slower moving animals like turtles and a lot of reptiles have a 3-chambered heart, where you have an incomplete separation of ventricles rather than complete, and there is some mixing of oxygenated and deoxygenated blood in the ventricles of the heart. This is good for turtles and other reptiles because sometimes you're going to dive underwater, and you don't want to waste the energy in the pulmonary circuit if you're actually not breathing. So during diving and during hibernation, you can kind of shut down the pulmonary circuit and just do the systemic circuit, and this saves a lot of energy. Whereas for amphibians, with their 3-chambered heart, is going to be the least efficient, but they're also, most of them don't really have lungs that they're going to use predominantly. So the amphibians are the least efficient, birds and mammals are the most efficient, but everybody's adapted for the amount of energy and the habitats they live in. When you go into a desert environment or a true terrestrial environment, osmoregulation and maintaining moisture is going to be extremely important. And so mammals, the constant struggle with metabolic wastes is the presence of ammonia. Ammonia is a byproduct of a lot of metabolic processes full of nitrogen, and ammonia is toxic even in small quantities. So if you're in the water, like most fish and amphibians, and you produce a lot of ammonia, you can just secrete it in dilute urine. And so the ammonia never reaches critical toxic concentrations in your body. But if you're a land-dwelling sand viper, like this one here, you can't secrete dilute urine. You'll dehydrate and die. So in most birds and mammals, the kidneys concentrate the ammonia into uric acid, which are these hard, solid crystals, and so you have very little water loss. In mammals, the kidneys transform the ammonia into urea, and it's a little more dilute than the uric acid, but it's still the same idea. You're kind of transforming it chemically into a less toxic structure and then secreting it. And so this is going to happen in kidneys, and then ion absorption is going to occur in the bladders. And particularly marine, there are some marine iguanas and some marine lizards and some marine crocodiles and some marine birds. And in any of these organisms, what's going to be the unique adaptation they need to overcome their environment? Well, they're going to live in an environment with more salt than other amniotes. So the danger there is that they're going to have too much salt. So in marine iguanas and marine birds, they're all going to have special salt secreting glands to prevent overabsorption of salt ions. And lastly, amniotes are highly sensitive to their environment. Their brains are the most complex, and their brains aren't just clusters of ganglia anymore. They are different substructures and centers of the brain are present. The primary difference that I would like to focus on is a complex cerebellum and a complex cerebrum. The cerebrum in particular is responsible for integrating sensory information from the environment and then communicating that information to your muscles. So this is rapid response, making quick decisions. And just for one example, this is the Basilisk Lizard. And the Basilisk Lizard is pretty remarkable. It can run on water to escape predators, but it can also swim. And so when the Basilisk Lizard is being hunted by a predator, it has to make a very rapid decision. Is this the time to run on water, or is it time to swim? Running is faster, but swimming is more energy efficient. And the reason they can run on water is that they can move so fast, and they have special pads on their feet that prevent the surface tension of the water from breaking. But not all water, not all puddles and pools and rivers have the same surface tension. So depending on those first few steps, that basilisk needs to know, is this water filled with algae and other stuff that's going to break the surface tension, and then I'm going to fall and flounder, or is this the type that I can run across easily? And so it also depends on the predator that's chasing it. Is it a bird chasing it? Is it a reptile? Is it a snake? Is it a jaguar? What is trying to catch it? And so what this basilisk lizard has to do, it has to integrate all the sensory information about the predator that's hunting it, the kind of predator it is, the hunting strategy that it's using, the surface tension of the water, the distance from shore to shore or to some other safe place, and then constantly has to adjust to escape predation. So this requires like some complex thinking, some complex, very rapid brain power. So this is primarily done in the cerebrum, where you're associating sensory information and then sending out the appropriate motor control signals to your muscles. And as mammals and birds especially become more social, sociality encourages even more brain development. So the most intelligent animals in nature are the ones that have a social organizational structure. And of course, amniotes are very diverse, but this is just a broad overview of the different things that make amniotes amniotes and make them particularly adapted to their terrestrial environment.